Hello there friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. When the prequel trilogy initially came out, we knew very little about these clone troopers that were fighting alongside their Jedi commanders. To the audience, these were just cool looking badass soldiers wearing futuristic armor and carrying big laser rifles. The fact that their faces were covered meant that not many of us thought about who was actually wearing this armor and what exactly was going on in their heads. It wasn't really until years later with the Clone Wars TV show that we would begin to truly get to meet and understand the individuals behind the helmets. And what we found were remarkably independent and decent young men whose only flaw perhaps was trusting their chain of command a bit too much. Now, years later, a lot of those young kids who grew up watching the Clone Wars have grown up and become adults. Many have actually served in the military themselves. And as adults watching the Clone Wars in the 2020s, you tend not to focus anymore on how awesome the battles look and how cool the vehicles and armor are. Instead, you're focused on the individual clones, the humanity they have, the personalities that they exhibit. There's also a sense of sadness and respect the audience have when they see all the sacrifices these clones are blindly willing to give. That's also consequently the tone that the last few seasons of the Clone Wars TV show takes. As an adult watching the Clone Wars TV show, you also marvel at how quickly polite society is willing to turn a blind eye to the exploitation of the clones as long as it doesn't affect them. But no matter how many battles the clones struggle through, no matter how many of their brothers get blown up right next to them, they still have to continue to fight on. A lot of this is because the Grand Army of the Republic was heavily outnumbered for most of the conflict. This meant very little rest or rotation off of the front lines, making this conflict a special type of hell, one that you can truly never escape. Now, the one argument that some people might make about using clone troopers on the battlefield that it is ethical because these individuals were genetically trained from the job. And it's true, these clones were trained for about 9 years or so to become soldiers, so it's somehow less cruel for these individuals to experience warfare than, I guess, normal non-clones. Also, Jango Fett was selected as the template for this clone program because of his natural affinity for violence, his aggression, his quick thinking, and also because of his courage and resilience to hardship. If Jango Fett enjoys warfare, surely the clones made from him will also enjoy warfare. And so, I guess it's okay to send them into these meat grinders. Or is it? We forget that these traits of being courageous don't actually protect an individual from the horrors of the battlefield. Sure, someone with Jango Fett's DNA might not complain as much about warfare. They might even enjoy it, but all human beings, no matter how tough you are, can only handle so much violence and trauma before they break. Even a clone trooper, it turns out. Since the beginning of human warfare, there have always been a certain percentage of men who would experience a mental breakdown of sorts after being exposed to combat. An American colonial militiaman who breaks down after surviving the British onslaught at Bunker Hill during the Revolutionary War would have been diagnosed with something called nostalgia. Yes, nostalgia, the same thing you and I have for old video games. Well, back then, nostalgia just meant that a soldier was occupied with past memories of war. Basically, whenever they saw an individual with PTSD or just kind of zoning out, they believed that these individuals were stuck in the past, which is actually a lot more true than later diagnoses of what PTSD would be labeled as. For instance, a Confederate soldier who took part in Pickett's ill-fated charge during the Battle of Gettysburg would have been diagnosed by a physician with soldier's heart. Of course, PTSD doesn't really have that much to do with the heart at all. It's more focused on what's going on in your brain. World War I soldiers would experience a ridiculous amount of artillery shelling in the trenches, and so their version of the ailment would be known as shell shock. And in World War II, the name was finally upgraded to combat fatigue. And by the way, up until this point, medics, physicians, military leaders, the general public believed that individuals who succumbed to combat fatigue were just generally individuals who had some kind of internal weakness or personality defect. So they blamed the actual soldiers for getting this disease. Now, later on, we find out that this was all wrong. Anyone can get PTSD. It wasn't about being strong-willed or stoic. We are all susceptible to trauma-related illnesses and these kind of things. And it wasn't until the 1980s that we actually coined the term post-traumatic stress disorder, which is what PTSD stands for. And so first, let's clear this idiotic and dangerous idea that PTSD only happens to weak people. It can happen to basically anyone because of the way our brains function. When something dangerous happens, your brain identifies it and releases stress hormones like adrenaline, which results in your body waking up. Your brain and nervous system becomes hyperactive. Your heart begins to pump faster in case you need to do some parkour to escape the threat. Now, these are generally good reactions for your body to have if, say, the local crackhead has finally turned against you, or maybe you like stealing honey from an anthropomorphic bear. I don't know. But like anything in the brain, the system can be overused and become imbalanced. Now imagine being deployed on a combat mission to a planet like Umbara, located in a ghost nebula. This planet has very little visible light and tons of native fauna and flora that's out to kill you. Oh, and on top of that, you're fighting against the Umbarans, a xenophobic species with highly advanced technology that you and your officers have never seen before. Oh, and on top of that, your Jedi General is trying to get everyone killed in constant frontal assaults against heavily fortified enemy positions. You're in a new place. There's no light, everything is dangerous, you can't trust your leaders. It's a perfect situation for trauma to occur. If you survive a campaign like this, massive friendly fire incidents, constant warfare around the clock, ambushes from crazy looking vehicles that look exactly like your biggest childhood fears, there's a good chance that you're in a state of heightened alertness the whole time on Umbara, and it's even possible that your brain now is going to be conditioned to be in that state. And so after partaking in a clone mutiny and taking out Krell, the mutinous Jedi General in charge of your unit. But when you're taking that shuttle ride back home, even though you're safe inside of that metal box, you're still sweating pretty hard. You can feel your heart pounding. You might have trouble breathing. Even though you're safe, your mind is still at war. Now, I should let you know, guys, PTSD can happen to anyone, not just soldiers. In the United States, around 3.5% of the population is affected by PTSD, and less than 1% of our population are actually active duty service members. And so actually the most common causes for PTSD include car crashes, natural disasters, crime, accidents like that, and of course, trauma suffered when we were young and our brains are less developed. And so you can get PTSD from a lot of different things, although those who have entered combat definitely have heightened rates of this disorder. So knowing what we know about what PTSD is and what causes it, it's almost certain that a huge percentage of the rank and file clones had to have suffered from PTSD. And the longer the conflict would go, the higher that number would be. Furthermore, it's even possible that the Kaminoans have hijacked the part of the brain that handles trauma in the clones for their own nefarious purpose. You guys remember when the clone trooper Tup's inhibitor chip was compromised and he ends up killing a Jedi General? Well, when Tup is about to pass away, do you guys remember what he says to his brother Fives?
You know the one. The mission. The one in our dreams that never ends. The one in our dreams.
Now notice when Tup is talking about this dream, the other clones in the room seem to understand or at least empathize with him. And later on, right as Fives is passing away, he says the following to Rex.
The mission. The nightmares. They're finally over.
So it turns out every clone, when they sleep, have this reoccurring nightmare of warfare that never seems to end. This is actually a central symptom of PTSD. Not just normal nightmares, but a very specific nightmare that is related to the trauma, the initial trauma you experienced when you got the PTSD in the first place. Now, I've always believed that these nightmares were purposely built into the inhibitor chips to condition the clones into obeying Order 66. And now, after figuring out how the trauma centers in the brain works, I'm beginning to realize something even more messed up. It's the other way around. It's actually these chips that are giving these clones essentially a super condensed form of PTSD. The way these inhibitor chips work is very similar to how trauma can really affect the brain. You see, when the clones are sleeping, the chip seems to activate the part of the brain that processes trauma, putting the clones into a fight or flight mode even when they're resting. This conditioning changes neural pathways in a clone's brain over the years, making the desired action of killing the Jedi even easier to accomplish and more natural when the time comes. The inhibitor chip then somehow triggers a PTSD-like trance in the clones when Order 66 is actually initiated. This is why during Order 66, no matter how much a Jedi pleads with their clones, they don't really hear them at all. These clones could be talking 1 second, and then the next second their helmet has dropped from their hands, and they're zoned out and they're staring right through you as they're pointing a blaster at your head. In extreme cases of traumatic stress, this is what happens. You can zone out or space out as the reptile brain takes over in response to the threat. And so you know how they say trauma can hijack the brain? Well, that's exactly what the inhibitor chip is doing. The conditioning that Palpatine and the Kaminoans used to control the clones are the same pathways along which trauma and stress are experienced. As if the story of the clone troopers weren't messed up enough already. Now, it should be said that combat-related PTSD oftentimes manifests itself once a soldier leaves the battlefield. That's when all the usual stressors are removed, but everyday things like fireworks, trash bags on the side of the road are still triggering trauma and stress. The clones were kind of lucky in a weird way because their war was their life and their family was their military. As cognitively messed up as they were, these clones were all cognitively messed up together, and so they could feel normal and respected in their own community. Their brothers. Whereas their behavior in civilian life might cause a lot of weird stares and even mistrust, amongst the brothers it's just another nervous tick or something like that, you know? You're still functional, you're still useful, and if you take a look at some of the older clones like Gregor or Wolf, you can see that there's something a bit wonky about their brains, but at least those two would find another cause to fight for during the rebellion. The key for these individuals is to stay busy. And this is really the sacrifice a soldier needs to make when they decide to choose this role in life. You're not just risking your life on a daily basis, you're also changing your brain and body and adapting them to the stresses of the battlefield and even training for the battlefield. And we're only really learning now what all the consequences are from being exposed to this kind of violence. Who knew that the wounds these young men would suffer from were not just in the form of bullets and shrapnel, but also mental injuries, an imbalance in the brain caused by repeated exposure to horror. With treatment, a good percentage of individuals who suffer from PTSD can fully recover. Another portion can kind of moderate their symptoms somewhat. But it does take treatment. It takes awareness that this is actually happening, which is why what the Empire does to the clones after Order 66 is even more messed up. Removing the clones from service not only stripped away the only purpose they had, it also broke down the support network the family of the clones had created to watch out for one another. Not all the clone troopers will be as lucky as Rex, Gregor, and Wolf. Most will be thrown out into the cold without the skills or ability to adjust to normal civilian life. They'll also be dealing with PTSD and other mental issues they acquired while in service of the Republic. So as you can see, the deeper you get into the story about the clone troopers, the darker it really gets. And now with the Bad Batch over, with the Clone Wars TV series over, it seems like there aren't going to be any more Clone Wars related stories left, and I think that'll be a huge missed opportunity by Disney. And because Disney loves money, I feel like they aren't going to drop the ball here. I mean, they might, but we really do need a live action, more gritty kind of war drama centered around the Clone Wars, featuring the clones. I mean, heck, it doesn't have to even be live action. It might be difficult to get like Tamora Morrison to play every character again. But yeah, this is definitely a part of the Star Wars galaxy that deserves more attention. Let me know in the comment section below what you guys think. Also, don't forget to subscribe, hit that notification button down below so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. As usual, my name is Alan, reminding you that my allegiance is to the Republic, to democracy. I'll see you next time, guys.